Hello, my name is Jun, and this is the basic introduction to the Korean language. And this would be episode 0 out of my series on teaching Korean. And a short disclaimer, I'm just a high school student trying to spread Korean to the world. I do not have a degree in teaching Korean, nor am I a professional expert in Korean. Because of this, I may have misinformation, and my videos may lack scientific or linguistic vocabulary. So, starting off, here's an extremely brief history of the Korean language. So Korean was, and this is debatable, but it was created in the unified Silla Empire time period. And let me explain. And Korea used to be more than one country. Back about 1,500 or 1,500 years ago, around the 6th century, Korea was made up of 3 major countries and a couple of small city-states and island nations here and there. The 3 major countries included the nation of Goguryeo, Baekje, and Silla. The other small countries included a group of city-states known as Gaya and the island nations of Tamla and Ulung. Although this time period was pretty long, it was eventually all conquered and unified by the nation of Silla, with the exception of the island nation Tamla, which is pretty significantly important. And with the Silla Empire, the original languages of the nations before unification, so the Goguryeo language, the Baekje language, the Gaya language, all of them were mixed together in this one gigantic mixture of languages called the Korean language. And that's what people normally refer to when they say Korean language. And that's where the origins of the Korean language came from the unified Silla Empire time period, or when the Silla Empire unified all the other languages around. And as I explained, the Silla Empire ruled all the nations except for the island nation of Tamla. And that's important because of that, the language of Tamla was not mixed to create the Korean language. So it was developed separately, although it is very similar because of the large amounts of trade that occurred between Tamla and the Silla Empire. Well, actually, not the Silla Empire. In later time periods, I believe they did trade quite a bit, and a lot of people immigrated to Tamla. Similar to Australia, actually, because a lot of people were sent to Tamla because of their criminal backgrounds. Uh, Similar to how Britain treated criminals and sent them to Australia. However, I am not too sure about that information. Anyhow, so because the Tamla language was developed separately from the Silla Empire, what happened was that they actually have their own language, you can say, and it is called the Jeju language, which is what people normally call Tamla today. And it's also one of the most beautiful islands in South Korea. So it was later unified to become South Korea. However, back then they were separate from the Silla Empire. They had their own nation, own government, and their own language, which I am actually trying to learn right now as well. So, just a side note. So, if you would like to learn the Jeju language or the Tamla language, go ahead. It's a very interesting language. It's it's very different from Korean, and it's known for being one of the languages that are very close to Korean, but also very different. So, it's just a side note. And now for the Korean writing system. So Korea, sorry about the typo there. So Korea used to use Chinese characters for writing. And the main reason why Koreans disliked Chinese characters was that they couldn't use Chinese characters to directly quote what people were saying. And um, and of course Chinese characters were pretty difficult to write, as you would imagine. Um, if you if you've seen Chinese characters before, they you do require um, a lot of prior knowledge to learn the Chinese characters. So because of that, a lot of people disliked it. A lot of people that couldn't afford a teacher could not learn Chinese characters. And besides that, also, as I have written here or typed, they could not directly quote what people were saying. And this means that they cannot write down what people were saying word for word on paper. So if a Korean person back in the day was to say, I really like eating food, instead of writing, I really like eating food word for word using Chinese characters, they would actually have to simplify and use ideas and depict ideas into Chinese characters. So they would probably use three Chinese characters, meaning I like food, instead of writing everything word for word. And that was a lot of people disliked that. So King Sejong the Great, one of the famous kings in Korea, he made in his own alphabetic system, and it was called Hunmin Jeongeum, but nowadays people just call it Hangul. And his system was to depict what the shape of the mouth, tongue, throat looked like to create each consonant, and he used other religious aspects to create the vowels. And he designed it so that the consonants and vowels were stacked together into syllables, creating what is called an alphabetic syllabary. And this is one of the greatest achievements he had made during that era, that time period. And this is what we will be using. We will be using the Hangul system created by King Sejong the Great as our basis for learning the Korean language. And I think I will make another series about Chinese characters and how to write Korean using Chinese characters, but that would be for a later episode. So some difficulties in learning the Korean language is that the Korean language uses a whole lot of prefixes and suffixes, and most of them originate from Chinese characters. So it's actually pretty useful if you know a large bank of Chinese characters. And that's because if you do know a large bank of Chinese characters, you can guess the meaning of a word even though you've never heard it before. And that's pretty similar to English, where English has Greek and Latin prefixes and suffixes. And if you learn Latin or Greek, even if there's a word that you've never heard before, you can guess by knowing what the prefixes and suffixes mean. And yeah, so these prefixes and suffixes, they make up most of the Korean language, most of the words in the Korean language. So it is very important to know a lot of them. And Korean also uses a whole lot of word and sentence particles. Just like a lot of other Asian languages like Chinese or Japanese, um, a lot of particles are used, and they are significantly difficult to learn than other aspects of the Korean language. And Korean also has a whole lot of words that are extremely hard to explain in English, and a lot of them would be a brand new concept for English speakers, so those will also be very difficult to understand and learn as well. So these were the difficulties, and that is it for this episode, episode 0 of the series, Korean language learning series. And this was just a brief introduction to Korean. So if you would like a more in-depth explanation to the Korean language, I will link some very useful videos by some other YouTubers down below, so check them out as well. And see you on the next episode. Goodbye.